So, welcome to the 10th and final webinar in the MarshWatch series. It's going to be our program wrap-up. It's going to be a pretty short webinar. Don't want to drag any of this out, but thank you all for tuning in for this little wrap-up webinar. I'd just like to say that I'm tuning in today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Stoney First Nation, as well as the Saulteaux and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I, of course, have been your host this whole time. My name is Leanne Latchmoy, and I have the privilege of working for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a nonprofit with a mission to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And I think this program kind of hits all of those nails on the head pretty well. So I've been pretty excited that I've been able to, deliver this programming because, as you've heard me say before, and as you can see in these pictures, I truly do love wetlands and I have spent a lot of time in them. So I've got a lot of tips and tricks for those wetland birds. So what did we get accomplished with this? So this was the pilot year of the MarshWatch programming. We have never done exactly this program before, and we've never really done kind of this, long iterative bird identification series, but we thought it would be good to do at a slow pace and introduce you kind of step by step to all of these different birds without feeding you 30 species at a time, because I've done other webinars or other in-person events in the past, and we cover a lot of species, and I never felt like we really got to do anything in depth, but we weren't sure if this was going to work out, if people were going to enjoy it, tune in and keep tuning in. But as you'll see in a little bit, I think it's been pretty successful. So the concept mostly came from Kyle Drake, and it was developed between the two of us. I put most of it together. He was kind of the mastermind behind it all. We also had input from colleagues across the nation. We have Doug Tozer, Amy Lee Cohenberg, Andrew Coughlin, and David Bradley, and those guys spanned from Canada coast to coast. So it was really a collaborative effort to pull this together, and what did we want it to be, and what did we want to communicate, and why were we doing it? Well, one of the big whys is wetlands are a really important part of the landscape. They're really important for humans, and they're really important for wildlife. They're really critical places. And if you were here at the very beginning of this series, we asked, are wetlands important? What have wetlands ever done for me? They do a remarkable amount. They absorb floodwater, for one, and that's really evident here on the prairie ecosystem, because we go through these, they can be pretty extreme wet and dry cycles. All of these wetland basins, they're filled with just this incredible organic soil that really does act like a sponge. And so when it's dry, that capacity to expand and absorb and retain water is there. So when we do get those big heavy rain inputs, all of these wetlands swell, they get larger, some of them overspill, but a lot of them do retain just phenomenal amounts of water. And it's not just the water that you can see pooling on the surface, it's all of that spongy material. If you've ever gone for a walk in a wetland, you know that it's not really a hard bottom thing, it's just this incredible mass of squishiness. And all of that is kind of extremely slowly decaying plant matter. So they store, an awful lot of carbon. They recharge the groundwater, so they hang on to that water, and then they slowly release it, much like a sponge, to the surrounding area. They can, there's some that recharge aquifers, but there's others that just, recharge the surrounding groundwater. They help to purify water as well. They're actually used in some systems to, purify sewage to help make it cleaner before it goes into, the main water body. So, man-made constructions modeled off of wetland processes, and some of them use just straight wetland. So they're pretty incredible at purifying water, and we as humans have taken advantage of that for a long time. They also prevent shoreline erosion. If you've got a beachy area, all of those big wetlands that are often, in conjunction along with your nice sandy spots, all of those big wetlands, they help keep that wave action down. And so, they allow you to keep some of that shoreline more intact, whereas if it was just beach, you tend to lose sand at a beach over time. But if you have a bunch of wetland plants, it retains that soil. Doesn't really make it nice for, our purposes that we like to sunbathe at, but it gives you a nice idea of that shoreline erosion. So next time you're at your local lake, just, take a look at what those wetlands, oftentimes at the margin of even larger lakes, are doing in terms of shoreline erosion. Like I mentioned, all of that squishy soil is decaying plant matter. It is phenomenal how much carbon these things store and for how long they store it. I remember in university, we were actually digging a soil pit in an old historic wetland. Like, it wasn't a wetland anymore, and it hadn't been for a very, very long time, but the earth was just incredible black. And as you got to a certain layer, you could actually still find wetland plants that were, half identifiable. It looked like there was cattails at the bottom of it. It's pretty incredible. So, they're a really good carbon storage area. And of course, I think, as we've covered pretty well in this webinar series, they provide food and essential habitat for a lot of different animals, fish, shellfish, water birds, land birds, all of that pulse of insects just feeds so much. Mammals use them, diversity is always attracted to, limited resources, and water is a pretty limited resource, especially good, clean water. And a lot of these wetlands provide that good, clean water. Like I said, they help to purify it. So, they're super, super important, and they have connections, well beyond that small wetland. You can see some potholes at the edge of the screen here, those tiny, unconnected basins, but they are connected through the insect inputs and the birds that come visit them. The nutrients that those wetlands provide get carried to other locations. So they're super critical for food, essential habitat, nutrient cycling, all of that good stuff for wildlife. And of course, they're really good food and resources for humans as well. Wild rice, if you've ever had cranberry juice, cranberries, they grow in bogs. Those are wetland plants. Fish, game, waterfowl are absolutely reliant on wetlands. And people also harvest plant roots. So wetlands are a super important part of our ecosystem, and especially on the prairies out here, they can get a little bit maligned. Oftentimes they're just seen as waste areas or places that you have to combine around, and everybody wants to drive a straight line. It's more efficient. But these wetlands that dot the landscape are just so incredible. And so I hope that, through a program like this, you gain a little bit of an appreciation for it. And if you want to submit checklists from any wetlands that you happen to see, going forward at any time, you hopefully have a little bit of skills to do that. And that's important information for us. That helps, fill in all kinds of little gaps of, yeah, we have information from this tiny pothole here somewhere. It's all really good information, but at the very least, hopefully, you've learned a little bit more about these birds. And I think, for me, a friend of mine took this photo, and this one always just drives home kind of that importance of wetlands for life. Here's this tiny young little mallard duckling, and it is just paddling like heck to get to this midge. And that's not a very big fly, but wetlands produce these incredible pulses of insects, and that's why a lot of these birds and animals are in these areas, is they're after a lot of that food resource. So sometimes we get a little bit annoyed at the bugs that might come from these places, but they are pretty critical. And something like a midge doesn't even bite, so more just a nuisance on the occasion. But I do love this photo. It really does, just kind of show you just how important even a tiny little fly is. You wouldn't think a tiny fly is important for a duck, but especially when they're this size, they're just trying to eat as much as they possibly can, and they gobble up all of these little flies and things. So I think they're pretty incredible places. Something like this seems pretty obvious, that like, oh, lots of life might occur here. This is a fairly extensive wetland. I can see a mix of water and standing vegetation. That darker stuff in the background is bulrush. The closer stuff that's lighter green is cattails. But even these kind of ones that don't hold a ton of water for the most part. You can tell this is a fair bit of a drier wetland, and even something like this is going to be producing insects, is going to provide drinking water, is going to provide habitat. There are species that exploit even these kind of areas specifically. Sedge wrens, marsh wrens, a lot of the, like, this is great rail habitat. It's shallow and they can scurry around and get lots of food, and still go and hide in the vegetation. So even something that looks like that is, it might not seem very important, but it all plays a pretty critical role. And that soil is pretty mucky and kind of wonderful to walk through sometimes. They're always fun to explore. And hopefully, throughout this program, you'll be able to get out and actually listen to the sounds of the marsh a little bit more. I played this at the very, very beginning of the webinar series, and I'm pretty sure some of you might have recognized a few birds that you heard on it, but I'm hoping when I play it now that, because we've gone through all of these species and we've gone through the calls and the songs that they make, that hopefully at least a few of these will be familiar. I'll play the track. It's about 40-45 seconds long, and then I'll show you what all was calling in it. But for now, I just kind of want you to just sit back. Imagine you're at this nice wetland, 7 o'clock, at least here in Saskatoon, and you're just at the edge of this wetland and you're just taking it all in, and you're listening to it. Or you can imagine it's 4 a.m. if that floats your boat. So here, let's play it. So if you had a pair of really good headphones on, you might have heard all of these species on this track. And there was indeed a lot of soars calling, doing that that little whinny call. Yellow-headed blackbirds were going, red-winged blackbirds were going. There was a bunch of marsh wrens. That American coot was making those pop, pop, pop kind of noises throughout. There was Wilson snipe winnowing. It kind of sounds like it's going all around off in the distance. And if you, like I said, if you have really good headphones, you could have heard the American bittern. I don't have a good pair in right now because this is the one I have with the microphone on it, but you could barely tell there was an American bittern in there. But hopefully, throughout this programming, you've got a bit more insight into, what's in the marsh that you can't see. Because a lot of the time, and this happens with birding in pretty well every habitat, you hear more than you wind up seeing. And it's kind of like a secret superpower that's actually pretty easy to get a hold of. You don't need to get bit by a radioactive spider or anything like that. You can just tune into a webinar like this and start to get some of those skills. And it's not all going to stick, of course, but if you get out and you practice them, and you'll have a starting point. You're like, oh, this sounds sort of familiar, maybe it's a blackbird. That gives you a starting point. So hopefully I've given you some of those tools to start doing that. How did we do overall? Well, we actually did. I was pretty impressed. I didn't expect it to do quite this well. I didn't put in a ton of advertising. I wanted to keep it somewhat on the small side because this was the pilot. We hadn't done this before. I wasn't totally sure how all of it was gonna, go over. But to my surprise, we've had 235 registrations for the webinar series. On average, we had 50 people attending each webinar, and that includes people who had others viewing with them. So if you stuck around and you did the quiz and you said, or the poll at the end and said, yes, I had 3 other people viewing with me, all of those numbers added up to make actually 50. It wasn't 50.1, it was 50 on the dot. I was pretty surprised. throughout the entire series, we had 115 people tune in. So, it's a long series. I don't expect everybody to make it to every webinar. And, some people were one and done, tuned in for one and didn't tune in for the rest. And that all of that's fine. I was really surprised at the number of hours our recordings have garnered. So the series has had 159 hours of view time on all of those videos combined. So I was pretty impressed at that. It seems like a lot of people are taking advantage of the video recording. So I think that's great. We've had a handful of people submit checklists so far. So I'm hoping that that number, just trickles and grows, as you will. So I'm pretty excited. I think this has been a pretty good pilot so far. I'm going to be sending a feedback survey. I'll be doing that tomorrow morning to everyone who registered, even if you didn't attend. But for you guys, I'm going to put it in the comment section in a moment here, just because, you might be interested in filling that out sooner rather than later. So I'll get that to you guys pretty quickly. At the end of the talk here, I'll send you the link in the chat. But, that's going to be your chance to let us know, what worked, what didn't. How did you feel about the length of the series, the length of the webinars themselves, if we should have covered, more or less material, anything you want to leave. And one thing I'm going to be asking for in that is some testimonials. So that's totally optional. You don't have to leave it, but I can tell funders and, when I'm applying for new grants that, hey, this program is great and people love it, but it means so much more if somebody who actually attended and enjoyed it says, hey, this is a really great program. That really helps us to be able to do more programming like this in the future. So if you want to leave, a little testimonial, those are always super appreciated. And that's what we use them for. We communicate with, the Birds Canada membership at large, reporting and all of that stuff, and even if we're, trying to promote a new program, it's like, hey, I'm giving a different program. This is what people said about past programs. You might think that this is worthwhile. So I'd really appreciate it if you could leave doesn't have to be long. It can be just a couple of words, but if you want to leave some of that, I'd be really glad as well. Otherwise, it's a fairly straightforward, short little survey. That's the only long form question if you want. And there's also an option to just, leave other comments if you thought like, hey, could do this instead. I welcome it. This is the pilot program and we plan to do this again next year, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit because, as you do something and deliver it, you learn from feedback too. So, don't feel bad about leaving feedback. Say, oh, it'd be great if you could add this or maybe less of that. Like I want to hear that stuff. So please fill out that survey if you can afterwards. Be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you want to submit a MarshWatch checklist, you can do this at any wetland at any time. That can be this year, that can be next year, it can be later in the summer, it can be in the fall if you're feeling confident with some of those fall birds. So it's pretty easy. There's an instructional video on the app. I think the app is probably the easiest way to do this because then you're kind of one and done. Download the app, enter in what you're seeing while you're seeing it, and then submit, and then you're done. You don't have to go back to the computer and remember to do it. So I'd really appreciate if you could submit a couple of checklists. They don't need to be complete. If you're like, oh gosh, Leanne, this was really interesting, but I still feel like all I know is a mallard for sure. Still tell me about the mallards. I'd like to see checklists from all over the place. And, all of that information is still useful. It is still valuable. If you're not telling us about everything, you're just saying like, I just know a couple of things. You're not submitting a complete checklist, select not complete. So that lets us know how to use the data. So it's all super valuable. And last but not least, thank you. Thank you guys for attending. Thank you for making this so wonderful. All of your, feedback throughout has been, great. It's been super helpful and I've really enjoyed it. Some of the back and forths have been quite fun in the discussion period. So it's been a really great journey for me, and hopefully it's been a worthwhile journey for you. I haven't been in my trusty red kayak in a while, but hopefully I'll be able to take it out in a couple of weeks and paddle around some wetlands and just sit by some cattails and listen, because that's one of my happy places. So looking forward to doing that sometime soon. If you want to get in touch, you can reach me at skatlas@birdscanada.org, or the harder to remember latramoy@birdscanada.org. You can visit the MarshWatch homepage on our main website at birdscanada.org/birdscience/marshwatch. And of course, you can reach Birds Canada on our website as well as on social media. And a big thank you to the supporters who funded this program and made it possible: the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, as well as Sask Power. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all so much. I'll turn off the recording and then I can take a look at all of those questions in chat. So yeah, I'll stop it now.